Hi, I'm Suzy, and I'm a postdoc in statistics based at the Insight Centre for Data Analytics in UCD's School of Maths and Stats. I'm interested in developing statistical methods for high-dimensional data. By high-dimensional data in stats, what we mean is that we have a really large number of observed variables or covariates, and spectral data is the perfect example of this, where our variables are our wavelengths. In some cases, we can have a much larger number of variables compared to the number of observations. To illustrate our proposed method, I'm going to use the famous grain data set, where we have wheat and rye feedstock and the spectral data of this, and we want to predict the ethanol concentration from the grain data. Typically, there are two methods that are most commonly used for this type of data, and that's partial squares and principal component analysis. These are both related methods where they both identify latent unobserved variables in the data and use these latent variables to build a model by reducing the dimensionality of the data. PLS works by identifying directions for both the response and the variables so that it leads to a really good predictive model. Anyone that uses PLS knows that it's hard to beat. Whereas principal component analysis and principal component regression identifies the principal components based on the variation explaining the data, and therefore doesn't include much information from the response variable, and so it doesn't necessarily do quite as good a job as PLS does. In an ideal world, we would want elements of both of these models to give us a really good predictive model that uses information from the response, but gives us this underlying probability distribution that the principal component analysis, our principal component regression model, has available to us. So we propose to use reordered probabilistic principal component regression, where we reorder the principal components based on the strength of the relationship with the response variable, and we exploit that probabilistic model underneath by sampling from the distribution of the scores rather than using the expected score that is usually done in PCR. To illustrate this, many of you will be familiar with the scree plot on the left, the blue plot, where we have our components ordered by the variation explaining the data. We suggest that there could be a scenario where principal components 4 and 5 are more strongly correlated with the response variable than earlier components 1 and 2, as in the red plot, and so they should be reordered so that 5 and 4 are more likely to be included in the variable selection than principal components 1 and 2, as in the green plot. And this leads to results as shown in the figure, where we have our true ethanol concentration in blue and the green intervals are our RP-PCR model comparing to the red intervals, which is traditional PCR. Traditional PCR has very large intervals, so even though the true observation is contained each time in the interval, it's actually quite uninformative, whereas our sampled intervals, okay, they sometimes don't contain the true value. However, they're much more concentrated and can give us more information, which would be more beneficial to the end user. As well as intervals around our response variable, we can also obtain intervals around any parameter in our model, as well as the root mean squared error, where a lower value and it signals that the model's better fitting. So we can see that RP-PCR comfortably beats PCR, doesn't quite beat PLS, which we wouldn't expect. However, we do get that level of uncertainty around our estimates.